It began on an unusually warm Saturday morning, the kind of day when the quiet hum of suburban life seemed unshakable. The street was calm, the lawns were freshly cut, and the air carried the scent of blooming azaleas. In this cul-de-sac, boundaries were rarely tested. Everyone respected each other's space, or at least that's what I thought. The first sign that something was off came when I stepped out to get the mail and noticed a car parked halfway up my driveway. Not just any car. A shiny silver SUV with tinted windows and a dent along the rear bumper. I didn't recognize it. My immediate assumption was that a guest from one of the nearby houses had simply mistaken my driveway for street parking. An innocent slip-up that would resolve itself. After all, mistakes happen. But as I approached the mailbox, I noticed something unsettling. The SUV wasn't just parked there temporarily. The engine was cold, and the windows were rolled up. Whoever had left it here had done so deliberately. I scanned the street and spotted my neighbor, Karen, standing in her yard, watering plants with a slow, methodical motion, as if she had all the time in the world. Our eyes met briefly, and I offered a polite nod. She didn't nod back. Instead, her gaze was steady, unblinking, and there was something faintly smug in the way her lips curved at the corners. It wasn't the look of someone caught in an innocent mistake. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. For the rest of the day, the SUV remained there, obstructing half my driveway. I was forced to maneuver my own car around it, a process that scraped my patience thinner each time. The following morning, it was gone, replaced by the usual stillness of my driveway, and I chalked it up to a one-time annoyance. But I underestimated just how far this would go. The second time it happened was a weekday evening. I returned from work to find the same silver SUV in the exact same spot. Only this time, it was parked even deeper into my property, the tires resting comfortably on the middle section of the concrete slab. Again, the engine was cold. Again, there was no sign of anyone retrieving it anytime soon. My patience frayed faster this time. I didn't confront anyone, not yet. I simply made a mental note and waited to see if a pattern would form. By the third incident, I didn't need to wait. I had already begun to suspect Karen. Her house sat just one property over, and the distance from her front door to my driveway was noticeably shorter than the walk from her own driveway to her porch. For someone with a certain mindset, someone who valued convenience over decency, my driveway would be the better option. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. And in suburban disputes, proof is everything. One night, I decided to test my theory. I parked my own car further down the street, in plain sight, leaving my driveway conspicuously open. Then I sat by my front window, lights dimmed, watching. It didn't take long. At precisely 8:47 p.m., I saw the silver SUV roll slowly into my driveway, brake lights glowing for a moment before the engine cut off. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Karen, tote bag slung over her shoulder, completely unbothered. She walked directly across my yard, not even sticking to the sidewalk, and into her front door without so much as glancing back. The brazenness of it was astonishing. She had claimed my property as her own parking spot without permission, without acknowledgement, without even the courtesy of asking. It was more than disrespect. It was entitlement, pure and unapologetic. And if I knew anything about people like Karen, it was that confronting them without solid evidence would only lead to more trouble. I needed something irrefutable. So I bought a camera, not just a basic doorbell model, but a high-definition, motion-activated security system with night vision. I mounted it discreetly, angled to capture every inch of my driveway and the approach from the street. For a week, I recorded footage, each clip confirming the same pattern. Karen parking her SUV in my driveway, walking across my yard, and disappearing into her house. Sometimes she stayed for hours, sometimes overnight. Not once did she ask permission. At this stage, it wasn't just a matter of inconvenience. It was a matter of property rights. My driveway was part of my deed, part of what I paid for when I bought this home. In the eyes of the law, this was trespassing. And yet, a part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would come to her senses and stop. But if anything, she seemed to grow bolder. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside to find her SUV, not only parked in my driveway, but angled in such a way that it blocked both my cars from leaving. The sheer audacity made my jaw tighten. It was the moment I realized this wasn't going to stop on its own. It was only going to escalate. And I decided right then, if she wanted a battle over my driveway, she had picked the wrong neighbor. The plan for revenge began forming in my mind that very day. The morning after Karen's SUV blocked both of my cars in, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the footage I'd captured. Every clip played like an episode in a slow-burning series of escalating disrespect. The dates, times, and angles were all perfectly clear. It wasn't just one or two isolated events anymore. It was a consistent pattern that stretched over weeks. And that morning, watching her smugly stroll across my property without so much as a glance back, I realized I was dealing with someone who wasn't going to be reasoned with. In the world of neighborhood disputes, there's a thin line between letting something slide and letting someone walk all over you. I'd reached that line, and Karen had stomped across it. The fact that she felt entitled to my driveway, as if it was some public space free for her personal convenience, wasn't just irritating. It was dangerous. If she could normalize using it, she could one day claim it outright. And from the way she carried herself, I suspected she might already believe it was hers. That suspicion was confirmed in the most infuriating way possible just 2 days later. I stepped outside to find not only her SUV in my driveway but also a pair of lawn chairs set up along the edge of my property, as if she had transformed it into her own personal patio. There were even 2 grocery bags on the hood of her vehicle, the faint scent of coffee and baked goods drifting in the air. She had made herself at home. It wasn't just arrogance, it was an attempt to redefine the space as hers. In suburban property disputes, that's no small thing. If a person uses someone else's land long enough without objection, they can sometimes claim adverse possession, essentially legal ownership by default. I wasn't about to let that happen. I knew that the law could be a powerful tool, but only if I used it strategically. That meant being patient, documenting every single incident, and resisting the urge to confront her too soon. One wrong move could jeopardize the case I was building, so I kept collecting evidence. Every morning before work, I checked the camera footage. Every evening, I made notes about the times her SUV appeared and how long it stayed. I even started snapping still images from the video, her walking across the driveway, her vehicle fully inside the boundary lines of my property, her unloading items directly onto my concrete. My documentation was airtight, the kind of proof that would leave no room for denial. In the meantime, I made subtle changes to reinforce the fact that my driveway was mine. I had the property survey from when I purchased the house framed in a protective sleeve, ready to present at any time. I measured the exact boundaries, marking the edges with discrete stakes just inside the concrete line. To the untrained eye, they looked like simple garden markers. To me, they were silent sentinels, physical reminders that the property had clear, indisputable borders. Still, Karen remained undeterred. In fact, it seemed as though my quiet efforts only encouraged her. One Thursday evening, I returned home to find her SUV in my driveway yet again, but this time she had parked diagonally, taking up nearly the entire width. My security footage later revealed she had done it in broad daylight, waving to passing neighbors as if she had every right to be there. That image, her cheerful wave while blatantly trespassing, burned into my mind. It was the final piece I needed to justify taking action. But before I made my move, I wanted to be absolutely certain there was no chance of this being chalked up to a misunderstanding. So I ran a quiet test. One weekend, I parked my own car in such a way that left just enough room for another vehicle on my driveway, but only if that vehicle squeezed awkwardly against the edge. It was a setup that any reasonable person would avoid. Yet, sure enough, Karen maneuvered her SUV into that exact spot, tires resting halfway on the grass, hood angled toward my garage. It was an intentional act. She wasn't just seeking convenience. She was making a statement. That was when I called my attorney. I didn't want to start with a lawsuit. Those could be costly, time-consuming, and would inevitably turn the neighborhood into a battleground. Instead, my attorney suggested a more precise approach. A certified letter formally notifying Karen that she was trespassing on private property. The letter would include a copy of the property survey, high-resolution stills from the security footage, and a clear demand that she cease parking on my driveway immediately. If she ignored it, the next step would be filing for a restraining order against her use of my land. But I had one more twist in mind before we even got to that stage. I decided to install a heavy-duty locking chain across the entrance to my driveway, not a flimsy rope or warning cone, but a solid weatherproof chain secured with a steel padlock. It wasn't just a deterrent. It was a declaration. The moment she saw it, she would know I was no longer playing defense. I was taking control. The installation was quiet, deliberate, and oddly satisfying. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. The chain hung firmly in place, gleaming faintly in the fading light. Anyone approaching my driveway would be met with an unmistakable barrier, both physical and symbolic. When Karen discovered it the next morning, the look on her face, caught perfectly on my security camera, told me everything I needed to know. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightened on her tote bag, and she turned sharply toward her house without even attempting to move the chain. But I knew this wasn't over. That expression wasn't surrender. It was calculation. She was planning her next move. And so was I. The chain had been in place for less than 48 hours before the first signs of retaliation appeared. At first, it was small, almost petty, the kind of thing you could dismiss as coincidence if you wanted to avoid conflict. A stray fast food cup tossed onto my lawn. A scattering of gravel that had mysteriously migrated from the street onto my driveway entrance. But in neighborhoods like this, nothing was truly accidental. Everything was calculated to send a message. Karen's reaction to the chain was predictable. People like her didn't respond well to boundaries, especially when those boundaries disrupted their own warped sense of entitlement. The moment she saw that gleaming steel barrier, I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, plotting how she might reassert control. The problem for her was that I had already anticipated this. Every angle, every possible countermove, I had thought it through in advance. I knew she wasn't going to let it go, and I wasn't going to back down. 3 mornings later, my security camera captured her standing at the foot of my driveway, staring at the chain like it was a personal insult. She paced, stepping forward, stepping back, eyeing the padlock with a calculating expression. Then she took out her phone and began snapping photos. She photographed the chain, the padlock, my lawn, even the side of my house. It was a reconnaissance mission, plain and simple. She wasn't just angry. She was preparing for something. That something arrived in the form of a folded letter taped to my mailbox 2 days later. It was printed on generic stationery, but the language was dripping with faux authority. Karen claimed that my driveway was publicly accessible shared property, and that my chain was an obstruction that violated neighborhood access rights. The letter made vague references to HOA bylaws, but here's the kicker. Our street didn't even have an active HOA. The organization had dissolved years before I bought the house. This wasn't a real notice. It was an intimidation tactic. But that wasn't all. That same evening, my security footage caught her SUV once again pulling into my driveway, or at least attempting to. She had moved the chain slightly to one side, as far as it would go without unlocking it, and wedged the front of her vehicle partially onto the concrete slab. The rest of the SUV hung awkwardly into the street. It was as if she was trying to plant a flag, to show she could still claim part of it. She left it there overnight. It was the clearest signal yet that she wasn't going to stop. And that meant I had to escalate too carefully. I contacted my attorney again, this time providing not just the footage of her parking, but also the letter she'd left me. Together, those two things painted a perfect picture of her behavior. The trespassing, the false claims, the ongoing harassment. My attorney suggested that we prepare a formal cease and desist letter, this time on official letterhead, sent via certified mail so she couldn't claim she hadn't received it. The document would outline exactly how and why her actions constituted trespassing, harassment, and attempted property encroachment, and warn her that continued behavior would result in legal action. Before mailing it, though, I decided to add one more piece of insurance. I contacted the county records office and obtained a fresh, certified copy of my property survey. The document clearly outlined the lot boundaries, including the exact measurements of my driveway, leaving no ambiguity. I also requested the deed itself, with the official stamp showing my legal ownership. These would be my trump cards, impossible for her to refute. When the certified letter finally landed in her mailbox, I didn't have to guess at her reaction. I saw it unfold in real time through my front window. She stood at the curb, envelope in hand, tearing it open before she even reached her porch. Her eyes scanned the page, and I could see the subtle changes in her posture. First disbelief, then irritation, and finally, something darker. She didn't crumple the paper. She didn't throw it away. Instead, she folded it slowly, almost deliberately, and marched into her house without looking around. That night, I found fresh tire marks in the strip of grass running alongside my driveway. They weren't from my vehicle. They weren't even from someone trying to park. They were deliberate ruts, driven in a curved path as if to skirt the chain and cut across my property without actually entering the driveway itself. It was childish, but it spoke volumes. She was telling me she'd find ways to trespass without technically breaking the exact rules I'd laid out. This was the point when most people might start second-guessing themselves. After all, neighborhood feuds have a way of poisoning the air for everyone involved. But I wasn't most people. I knew her type. She wasn't just doing this for convenience anymore. It had become a matter of pride. She needed to win, even if that meant making herself look ridiculous in the process. And if she wanted to turn this into a game of endurance, I was more than willing to play. Because I had the one thing she didn't: patience, proof, and the law on my side. The next morning, I made my move, one that would take this from petty drama into undeniable legal territory. By the time I reached the 4th week of documenting Karen's antics, the game had shifted. It was no longer a simple case of keeping her off my driveway. It had become a matter of principle. Every action she took, every petty stunt, every false claim, only strengthened my resolve. And now I was ready to stop playing defense altogether. The first step was putting my plan into motion, a plan designed to ensure that every future move she made would work against her. I began by filing an official trespassing complaint with the local police. This wasn't about getting her arrested on the spot. It was about creating a paper trail. With the complaint filed, every subsequent incident wouldn't just be a neighborly disagreement. It would be a documented violation of law. The officers who took my statement were thorough. They reviewed the security footage, took photos of the property boundaries, and made notes about the chain across the driveway. The moment the report was filed, I knew I had established the first official layer of protection. Karen couldn't claim ignorance anymore. She had been formally warned, not by me, but by the authorities. Predictably, the warning only seemed to irritate her further. Over the next few days, she escalated in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. I'd find loose trash tossed at the base of the chain, small branches mysteriously broken from my hedge, a thin trail of tire tracks appearing along the grassy edge of my lot, looping from the street to her driveway like she'd taken a shortcut just to prove she could. But what she didn't know was that every one of these incidents was being logged, time-stamped, and backed up in multiple places. I'd upgraded my security system to include additional hidden cameras, one aimed discreetly at the lawn from the side of my house, another covering the edge of the street from an upstairs window. Between the main driveway camera and these new angles, there was no blind spot left for her to exploit. The turning point came one Thursday morning. I had just stepped outside to retrieve a package when I saw her SUV stopped at the base of my driveway. She was leaning out the driver's side window, phone in hand, filming the chain as if gathering her own evidence. She lingered there for a good 2 minutes before pulling away, but not toward her house. Instead, she drove in the opposite direction, toward the courthouse downtown. It didn't take long for her move to reveal itself. A week later, I received an envelope from the county clerk's office. Inside was a formal notice of a civil complaint. Karen had filed a claim asserting that my driveway was shared property and that my chain constituted an unlawful obstruction. Her claim included a crude diagram she had drawn herself, showing her house, my house, and a strangely distorted representation of the property lines. conveniently skewed to make it look like my driveway extended into some vague public easement. To anyone who understood property law, it was laughable. But I knew better than to take it lightly. Even a frivolous claim had to be answered formally, and if she wanted a court fight, I was ready to give her one. I contacted my attorney immediately, forwarding every piece of evidence we'd collected so far: the certified property survey, the deed, the security footage, the trespassing complaint, the cease and desist letter. We had a mountain of proof, and it was all neatly organized. When the court date arrived, I made sure to be early. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table with my attorney while Karen, wearing a smug expression, took the opposite seat. She carried a binder thick with loose papers. Most of them, I suspected, were irrelevant printouts meant to look impressive. She spoke at length about neighborhood customs and reasonable access. But when the judge asked for official proof of her claims, her confidence faltered. My attorney presented the property survey first, a certified document with precise measurements showing my driveway was fully within my lot lines. Then came the deed, stamped and recorded. After that, we rolled the footage. Clip after clip showed Karen's SUV in my driveway, her walking across my lawn, her blocking my vehicles, her moving the chain. It was meticulous, undeniable, and devastating to her case. By the time the judge rendered the decision, there was no ambiguity. The driveway was my sole property. The chain was a lawful barrier, and Karen was ordered to cease any and all attempts to park on or obstruct my property, under penalty of fines and potential further legal action. It was a complete victory. But in situations like this, victory isn't always the end. People like Karen rarely accept defeat gracefully. As I walked out of the courthouse, I could feel her eyes on me, burning with resentment. She hadn't said a word during the final moments of the hearing, but her silence carried a warning. She wasn't finished. And sure enough, she had one more play left in her. One that would turn this quiet property dispute into a neighborhood spectacle. The court's decision should have been the end of it. On paper, it was absolute. My driveway was mine alone, the chain was legal, and Karen was forbidden from touching either without explicit permission. The ruling was backed by the full weight of the law, complete with the threat of fines for any violation. But Karen wasn't the type to bow out quietly. Her next move came not through the courts, but through the court of public opinion, the neighborhood itself. She knew she couldn't win legally, so she turned to the one weapon she still had: gossip. It began with whispers. Neighbors I'd always had pleasant exchanges with started giving me tight, awkward smiles instead of their usual greetings. Others avoided eye contact altogether. One afternoon, I saw Karen chatting animatedly with two residents from down the street, gesturing toward my driveway and the chain as if explaining some great injustice. I could guess the story she was spinning. I was the unreasonable neighbor, the one hoarding shared space and making life harder for everyone else. Within days, the shift was unmistakable. A couple of neighbors parked their own vehicles conspicuously close to my driveway entrance, not blocking it but narrowing the approach just enough to be inconvenient. A lawn sign that had stood for months in support of community cooperation suddenly vanished from my yard, and I later spotted it stuck in Karen's. Even the usual rhythm of street life felt altered, conversations dying out when I walked past. But gossip was only the beginning. Karen escalated with a coordinated stunt that turned the entire cul-de-sac into a stage. One Saturday morning, I woke to find every available street parking spot in front of my house filled, not with residents' cars, but with an odd assortment of visitors' vehicles: pickup trucks, sedans, even an old RV with faded paint. They lined the curb in a tight row, engines silent, windows reflecting the morning light. It wasn't random. This was a blockade. Through my upstairs window, I caught sight of Karen directing the drivers, waving them into position with exaggerated arm movements. She lingered in the street like a traffic coordinator, smiling as each vehicle settled into place. When she finally walked back to her house, she did so with the slow confidence of someone who believed she'd just scored a decisive blow. The message was clear. If she couldn't use my driveway, she'd make it as inconvenient as possible for me to use it myself. Navigating in and out required a tedious multi-point maneuver, each turn calculated to avoid scraping the chain or a parked bumper. It was petty, yes, but it was also clever in its own way. The vehicles weren't technically blocking my driveway, so the police couldn't intervene. Instead of reacting in the moment, I watched. I documented. I recorded license plates, dates, and times. I noted which vehicles appeared multiple times, which only showed up once. Patterns began to emerge. Many of the cars belonged to friends or relatives of Karen. People who didn't live on our street but had suddenly taken an interest in spending hours parked directly outside my property. Meanwhile, she doubled down on her social campaign. A printed flyer appeared in neighborhood mailboxes, unsigned but dripping with her tone. It accused an unnamed neighbor of selfishly hoarding community space and fostering hostility. The vague language was enough to avoid legal trouble but transparent to anyone who knew the situation. What she hadn't counted on, though, was that not everyone was buying her version of events. A few neighbors, ones I'd quietly built trust with over the years, began sharing what they were hearing. Some told me they'd been approached directly by Karen and asked to help her make a point by parking near my driveway. Others reported that she was telling people the court case had been unfairly decided and that she was still fighting to get her rights recognized. It became clear to me that she was trying to manufacture a sense of majority opinion against me. If she could get enough people on her side, perhaps she thought I'd eventually give in, remove the chain, and let her reclaim what she still believed was hers. But her scheme was built on one fatal weakness: the truth. I began turning her tactics back on her, quietly and methodically. When I spoke to neighbors, I didn't launch into accusations or anger. I simply shared the facts: the certified property survey, the court ruling, the police report. I showed them short, undeniable clips from the security footage: Karen parking in my driveway, moving the chain, blocking my vehicles. I didn't embellish or editorialize. I just let the evidence speak for itself. The effect was slow but steady. The whispers began to shift tone. The awkward glances faded. The blockade of visitor vehicles thinned out, as fewer people were willing to lend themselves to Karen's performance. What she had counted on as a tidal wave of support was beginning to erode into scattered puddles of loyalty. And then, just when it seemed like she might be losing her grip on the neighborhood, she tried one last desperate gambit. Late one night, long after the street had gone quiet, a faint metallic rattle echoed outside my window. I checked the driveway camera feed and froze. There she was, Karen, crouched at the base of the chain, fumbling with the padlock. She had something in her hands, maybe bolt cutters or a heavy wrench, and she was working with hurried precision. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I simply let the camera roll. Because in that moment, I knew she'd finally crossed the line from petty harassment into something far more serious, and I was ready to use it to end this battle once and for all. The courtroom was packed tighter than anyone expected for such a small neighborhood dispute. What had started as a petty argument over driveway space had snowballed into a legal spectacle. The air was thick with anticipation as curious locals, HOA members, and even a few Karen sympathizers sat in hushed rows. They all seemed to be waiting for the same thing: the moment when either I would be humiliated for overreacting or Karen would be publicly shamed for her brazen arrogance. Karen walked in first, heels clicking on the tile with a kind of self-importance that almost seemed rehearsed. She had dressed for the part: pressed blazer, neatly styled hair, and an expression that screamed confidence. In her mind, this was her victory lap. Her lawyer sat beside her, flipping through a few papers without much interest, as though the outcome was already in their favor. I sat on the opposite side, calm and collected, my own stack of documents neatly organized in a folder. I had been waiting for this day for weeks, every piece of evidence meticulously prepared, every witness ready to testify. I knew the facts were on my side, but I also knew that Karen's confidence came from somewhere. She clearly thought she had something to win this. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Karen's lawyer wasted no time in painting a picture of her as the victim: a poor, overburdened woman forced to park elsewhere because of unclear property boundaries, and my supposed refusal to be neighborly. According to her story, the driveway had been shared for years by the previous owners, and I was breaking some unspoken tradition. The murmurs in the audience hinted that some people were buying into her tale. But I didn't flinch. I had been expecting this exact argument, and I had something far stronger than her speculation. When it was my turn, I laid out the facts in measured, unwavering detail. I produced the original property deed, a legally binding document that clearly showed the boundaries of my lot, including the driveway. Then I produced the land survey, stamped and signed by a licensed surveyor, conducted just months ago. It aligned perfectly with the deed. I even had photographs from before I purchased the house, showing the previous owner's cars parked in that exact driveway, proof that it had never been shared. But I wasn't done. I pulled out one more document, one that I had been saving as my trump card, a notarized statement from the previous owner himself. In it, he confirmed that the driveway was his and his alone, and that Karen had never been granted permission to park there. The moment the judge's eyes scanned the letter, I could see the shift in the room's energy. The whispers started, this time favoring my side. Karen's face tightened, her confident posture faltering. Her lawyer scrambled to object, but the judge shut it down, stating that the evidence was clear, compelling, and indisputable. Karen's claim was dismissed outright, and she was ordered to cease parking in my driveway immediately. But there was more. The judge also addressed her repeated trespassing, noting the documented incidents and the harassment I had endured. Karen was hit with a fine for violating property laws, and the judge authorized me to install a locking gate across my driveway if I wished, at her expense. The verdict was final. Karen sat frozen, her face flushed with humiliation. The once proud smirk was gone, replaced by a silent glare that could have burned through steel. When the gavel came down, I didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even look in her direction. I simply gathered my documents, thanked my lawyer, and walked out into the fresh air. The neighborhood might talk about this for weeks, maybe months, but for me it was over. Over the next few days, Karen avoided me entirely. The once loud voice that had carried across the fence was now silent. Her driveway was suddenly empty more often than not, and the sight of her car parked a little farther down the street felt like the quietest, sweetest victory I could have imagined. The locking gate went up within a week, paid for in full by Karen as per the court order. Every time I clicked it shut at night, it wasn't just about keeping my property safe, it was about the principle. She had tried to take what wasn't hers, tried to bend the truth until it fit her version of reality. And in the end, the truth had been stronger. The neighborhood eventually moved on, though the story lingered in whispers. People who had doubted me now nodded in quiet respect when we crossed paths. And while I had no intention of becoming friends with Karen, I was content knowing she would think twice before trying something like this again. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reminder that sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud or flashy. Sometimes it's methodical, undeniable, and final. And for Karen, it was a lesson she wouldn't forget. Because in the end, she hadn't just picked the wrong driveway. She had picked the wrong neighbor. One